The wind whistled across the wide plains like it carried old secrets no one wanted to say out loud. The sun was dropping low, painting the dry fields in shades of gold and rust, while a wagon rolled slowly down the dirt road leading to a lonely ranch house that stood far from town. The boards of the porch looked worn, the paint faded, and the land around it looked as tired as the man who stepped out to greet the wagon. He wiped dust from his brow and stood tall, even though life had done its best to bend him. Folks in the county called him a stubborn rancher, a man who refused to sell his land when new cattle syndicates came buying up every open field they could. He had worked this land since he could walk, and though he had lost family, livestock, money, and nearly hope, he held on to the soil like it still had a future. Inside the wagon sat a young woman with cold fingers wrapped tight around a small canvas bag that carried all she owned now. She watched the rancher with cautious eyes, unsure if she should smile or step back. She had traveled miles from a crowded town where factory smoke and harsh landlords had taken away every chance of peace. When she received a letter offering shelter, food, money, and a legal union, she thought it might be a doorway to survival. But now that she was here, staring at the empty land and this quiet rancher, doubt crept into her chest. She wondered if she had traded one hardship for another. He approached the wagon slowly, stopping a few steps away like he respected her space. He cleared his throat and said he was grateful she made the journey safe. His voice was steady but carried a strange mix of hope and guilt. He told her she could rest first before discussing anything. She nodded but kept her gaze on him, trying to understand what kind of man needed to marry a stranger through a written agreement. She sensed he was honest, but she also saw the tension in his posture, like there were things he refused to say unless forced. The ranch had soil rich enough to grow more than just cattle feed, but only if registered landowners worked together under certain new laws passed in the territory. He needed a partner to keep legal rights to the land. She needed a place to start life over. Their meeting was not guided by love, family ties, or fate. It was guided by necessity and a signature. That knowledge settled heavy in both their hearts as she stepped down from the wagon. Her boots touched the dusty ground, and she noticed how wide the sky felt here. It made her chest rise in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost freeing. But freedom came tied to choices, and choices brought consequences. She followed him to the house, carrying her bag, though he offered to take it. She refused gently, wanting to hold on to what little she still controlled. He understood without arguing. Inside the ranch house, the smell of wood smoke filled the air. The walls carried old family memories and faded photographs and simple trinkets. She saw a portrait of a woman who once lived here, placed on a shelf but not dusty, as if someone still spoke to her in quiet moments. The young woman swallowed hard, wondering if she was stepping into a story that had not yet healed. The rancher noticed her eyes pause on the portrait and said the woman had passed long ago. He said no more. As night settled in, he boiled water for tea and set 2 mugs on the table. They sat across from each other in silence, the only sound being the crackling fire. He finally unfolded a paper from his pocket, placing it gently between them. The paper held their agreement, signed by both in ink, sealed, stamped, and witnessed by a county clerk. It stated that they would enter into a lawful marriage, not based on affection but cooperation. She would receive part ownership of the ranch, and he would keep the land from being seized by large cattle syndicates that wanted to take over local property. She stared at the paper, tracing the printed words slowly. She had known its terms well, yet seeing it here on the kitchen table, under the eyes of a man she barely knew, made it feel heavier. She finally spoke in a voice barely above a breath, asking why he chose her. There were plenty of women in nearby towns, widows, farmers, daughters, or others with more experience and stronger ties to ranch life. Why reach so far? Why choose a stranger with no family, no land, and no reputation worth speaking of? He leaned back, rubbing the edge of his mug. He explained that most people here already had unspoken alliances or would demand more land than he could give. She was different. She came from far away, unlinked to local politics, carrying no expectations except to survive. He believed that someone stripped of comfort might understand how important land can be to a man who has lost everything else. His voice softened when he said he did not want to control her, only to save what remained of his family's legacy. The silence that followed was thicker than night itself. She let his words sink in, but something in her heart ached. She had fought too many battles where people used her because she had nowhere to go. She whispered the question again, this time with trembling. "You want to marry me just for the land?" "Why me?" Her eyes met his, searching for truth beyond practical words. He looked away, unable to answer quickly. The firelight flickered across his face, showing a man torn between need and conscience. She felt a pang of fear. If this union was only a transaction, what would happen when the land was secure? Would she be set aside, ignored, or treated as a burden? She wondered if there was any chance dignity, trust, or even kindness could grow in a marriage bound by contract. Outside, coyotes howled from distant hills, carrying the haunting sound of wild freedom. The young woman wrapped her arms around herself, feeling both small and strangely strong. She had survived worse than loneliness. But committing her future to a rancher with hidden wounds and an agreement that felt like a crossroads made her heart beat fast. The ranch felt full of promise and danger at the same time. He finally lifted his eyes, ready to speak. She leaned forward, breath held, waiting for the truth he had kept buried since the letter that started all this. But before a single word left his mouth, the door rattled with harsh knocks from someone outside, pounding as if delivering trouble. She froze, and he stood up, reaching for the lantern. The night outside carried footsteps, voices, and tension. Whoever stood beyond that door had come for something more than a polite visit, and their arrival would decide what kind of marriage this would become. The lantern flame wobbled as he lifted it, casting long shadows on the walls as if the house itself was holding its breath. The knocks returned, harder this time, echoing through the narrow hallway and shaking dust from the rafters. She stepped back from the table, clutching her small bag to her chest, while he approached the door with steady steps. For a moment he hesitated, his hand hovering over the latch like he already knew trouble waited outside. When he finally pulled the door open, cold night wind rushed in, along with 3 men from town. Wrapped in wool coats and wearing expressions that carried more curiosity than kindness, they greeted him by name, though their tone felt too friendly to be true. One man nodded at the young woman standing near the table and asked if this was the girl he had written about. The question cut the silence sharply. She felt her face grow warm as all eyes settled on her, studying her the way traders study a horse before claiming it. She stepped forward slowly, not wanting to look afraid, though her heartbeat thudded loud in her ears. The rancher spoke before she could, saying she was his future wife and that the matter would be finalized soon. The men exchanged glances like they were adding numbers in their heads. The first man leaned, his elbow on the doorframe, and spoke about how folks in town had heard rumors. He said word spread fast when a rancher pulls a stranger across 2 counties for marriage. He said people wondered what deals she was getting out of it, and how much land she would end up with once the contract turned into legal ownership. She did not miss the way he smirked at the end, like the idea of her deserving anything was a joke. The rancher stiffened and told him that what happened on this land was no business of theirs. His voice stayed calm, but the tension in his shoulders spoke louder. The men continued asking questions that sounded polite but carried barbed edges. They wanted to know if she planned to help run cattle, or if she would push him to sell sections of land to lumber companies. They hinted at debts, at past disputes, at deals made long ago that people in town had never forgotten. She noticed how the rancher's jaw tightened every time those hints came up. The men left as quickly as they arrived, tipping their hats and warning him to be careful with strangers who come from nowhere with nothing to lose. When the door shut, the house returned to stillness. But the damage lingered in the air. The rancher apologized for the late visit and said, people in town could be protective about local land. She understood he was trying to be gentle with his explanation, but she sensed there was more beneath his calm words. When she asked what history he had with them, he said businessmen in the region had been trying to buy parts of his ranch for years, and now, with new territory laws, a marriage could either strengthen his land rights or weaken them if someone managed to interfere. She wondered if those men came out of concern or out of envy. Hoping to see him fail so they could finally claim the soil beneath his feet, the young woman unpacked her small belongings that night, placing a folded dress on the bed and a worn locket beside the lamp. She kept the locket closed, as if opening it might spill memories she was not ready to share. Outside, the rancher stood on the porch long after the men rode away, staring across the quiet plains as though ghosts moved through the grass. She watched him through the window, trying to understand what drove a man to fight for land so fiercely that he would bind his future to a stranger. The next morning brought gray light and the cries of distant cattle. She stepped outside, breathing crisp air that held a faint scent of sage. The rancher was already working, repairing a fence near the pasture. She walked over and offered to help, and though he hesitated, eventually handed her a piece of rope to hold while he tightened the wooden posts. He watched how she stood, how she worked, and she noticed he looked surprised she did not complain. She explained she had grown up working since childhood, though she did not go into details. He nodded respectfully, sensing pain behind her calm tone. Later they walked across the field, and he explained how the ranch once belonged to his parents, how his father built each fence post by hand, how his mother planted wildflowers along the old creek bed that had dried out during past droughts. She could hear the pride in his voice, but there was sorrow too, like he carried more ghosts than memories. When she asked how he lost them, his voice dropped. He said sickness took most of his family, and a greedy creditor took the rest. She understood why the land mattered. It was the last piece of his past he still owned. As they returned to the house, she asked why he trusted her enough to sign such a large agreement. He paused before answering, saying he did not know if trust was the right word. He simply saw someone who needed a future as badly as he needed to protect his land. He believed two people with nothing left could build something new if they had reason to hold on. His words carried warmth, but she also sensed fear hiding behind them. He was a man prepared to sacrifice everything for this soil, and she wondered where she would stand once the land no longer needed her signature. Over the next days, she settled into a quiet routine. She helped feed livestock, washed old linens, and fixed hinges on kitchen cabinets that had rusted from age. She even swept dust from the porch, feeling like each small act stitched her into the ranch's fabric. But every evening she noticed the rancher studying the horizon. Eyes narrowed like he expected riders to appear with bad intentions. She knew the men from town were not done, and others might come with different motives. The land was more than grass and fences. It was a prize everyone seemed hungry for. One afternoon she walked past the old barn and found a corner filled with faded documents, sealed letters, and land maps tucked inside a metal lockbox. She touched the papers lightly, realizing they were proof of ownership, records of disputes and maybe secrets kept from public eyes. When she heard footsteps behind her, she turned to see the rancher watching her with guarded expression. He closed the box slowly and said those papers were not just records. They were shields against those who would carve his land apart. She nodded, but a question lingered in her mind. If he needed her only to strengthen those papers, what happened once the ranch was fully protected? Would he need her at all? She did not voice the question, but the worry stayed with her, like a shadow that followed her across the field. That night a storm rolled in, bringing lightning that cracked across the sky and thunder that shook the windows. The two sat by the fire, listening to rain pound against the roof. The rancher looked up from his cup and asked if she regretted coming here. She hesitated, then said she did not know yet. She was grateful for shelter, but she wanted more than a transaction. She wanted a life where she mattered beyond her signature. He stared into the fire and admitted. He feared she might leave once she learned how bad things truly were. She asked what he meant, but before he could answer, thunder roared so loud it drowned his voice, and the old barn door slammed open outside. The storm brought more than wind. Someone was out there, moving through the rain toward the house. She rose to her feet, heart pounding, while he grabbed the lantern and stepped toward the door again, just like the night she arrived. But this time, the footsteps were heavier, slower, and more deliberate. Whoever approached did not knock. They simply reached for the door handle from the outside. The handle turned slow, metal scraping against metal. And for a second, the only sound inside the house was the harsh breathing of two people. who did not yet know if they could trust each other. The rancher moved first. He set the lantern on a side table and wrapped his hand around the door, pulling it open with a sharp tug. Wind and rain rushed in, carrying the heavy shape of a man hunched under a soaked coat. Lightning flashed behind him, framing his outline against the dark yard. The visitor stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Water dripped from the brim of his hat, forming a small puddle on the floor. He pushed the door shut with the heel of his boot and glanced from the rancher to the woman by the fire. His eyes lingered on her, then dropped to the table, where the folded contract still lay from earlier. His mouth curled into the hint of a dry smile. He introduced himself as the man who managed accounts for a local cattle company, one of the outfits always circling the ranch's borders. His tone was polite, but it carried a cold edge. He said he had come because certain people in town were concerned about sudden changes in land papers and marriage agreements. He added that they wanted to make sure everything was legal, fair, and not a threat to their growing business. The words sounded almost kind, but she heard the warning underneath. The rancher's shoulders tensed. He asked why a private marriage and contract on his own land should matter to any company. The man explained that when a rancher brought in an outsider and handed over part ownership, certain rights changed. Land that was once easy to pressure could become harder to touch when another signature joined the deed. He looked at the woman as he said it, as if reminding her that her name now stood between this house and those who wanted to carve it apart. She stepped closer to the fire. Feeling the heat on her back and the chill from the visitor's eyes on her face, the man asked if she understood the size of the land she was about to share. He mentioned numbers, acres, water rights, grazing routes, and access to the rail line that might one day cut across parts of the territory. The words meant more to businessmen than to her, but she still understood one thing clearly. They did not see her as a person. They saw her as a problem. The rancher told the visitor that his business was finished and he could ride back to town. But the man refused to leave without giving one more message. Said some folks had long memories. He still remembered certain disputes, loans, and broken promises tied to this ranch. He reminded the rancher of an old debt left over from years. Of drought, a debt that had never quite died, only changed hands. The woman watched the rancher's face harden as the man spoke. She realized there were parts of his story he had not shared. Before leaving, the visitor gave the woman a long, measuring look and said if she ever felt the contract was unfair, there were people in town who would gladly help her come to a different arrangement. They could offer money, housing, and a fresh start if she chose to sign away her part of the land in another direction. It did not need to say whose side they were on. It was written in the way he stood, the way he smirked, the way he walked, back into the storm as if he'd already owned the ground under his feet. After the door closed, the house felt smaller. The rancher picked up the lantern again, but his hand shook slightly. She saw it and pretended not to. Instead, she asked about the debt the visitor mentioned. He tried to brush it off, saying most ranchers owed someone something. When she pressed, he finally admitted that after his family died and the drought hit, he borrowed money against part of the property from a man who later sold that claim to the cattle company. They had been trying to use that leverage ever since, pushing him to sell more land, to back down, to move on. She realized then that their marriage contract did more than protect the ranch. It placed her right in the middle of a silent war over ownership. The land, the marriage, her signature were all tangled together in a way she had not fully understood when she stepped off the wagon. Over the next week, tension settled over the ranch like a low cloud. The storm passed, but visitors kept showing up. A woman from town brought a basket of bread and kind words, yet her questions about the contract felt too sharp to be friendly. A ranch hand from a neighboring spread rode by, pretending he just wanted to say welcome. But he steered the conversation toward how hard it was for small ranchers to stand alone. He suggested joining forces with a company that had backing and wanting money, hinting that it was better than being crushed later. At night, the young woman lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the window shutters. She thought about the choices in front of her. She could hold on to the contract and side with the rancher, tying herself to his struggle and his debts. Or she could listen to the voices from town saying she could walk away, maybe even profit, if she signed in their favor. Neither path felt clean. One was full of hard work and danger. The other tasted like betrayal. During the day, she worked beside the rancher, moving quietly through chores while watching him from the corner of her eye. She saw how tired he looked when he thought she was not paying attention. She saw how the lines around his eyes deepened whenever a rider appeared on the road. Yet she also saw how gently he handled a sick calf, how carefully he fixed the roof so no more rain would leak into her small room. He did not speak much, but he showed care in small actions. That made things harder, not easier. One evening, as the sky turned the color of cooled ashes, he asked if she wanted to ride the fence line with him to see the full spread of land that would one day bear her name beside his. She agreed, curious to see it through his eyes. They saddled 2 horses and rode out past the main pasture, climbing small ridges that overlooked valleys and dry creek beds. From up high, the land looked endless. Even in its rough state, it held a quiet kind of beauty. She watched his face. As he looked out over it, saw the way his shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. He pointed to a far boundary where an old cottonwood tree marked the edge. Beyond that lay property already taken by the cattle company. He explained how they had moved their fences an inch at a time over the years, always claiming it was a mistake, always trying to push their line deeper into his land. He had spent hours riding those borders, moving posts back, arguing with hired men who pretended not to know better. The battle was slow, not always loud, but it never stopped. On their way back, they passed a dry well near a broken windmill. She asked about it, and he told her something he had not mentioned before. It's under part of his land. Surveyors believed there might be more than just water. Some spoke of minerals. Others said the ground held value for reasons that had nothing to do with cattle or crops. That rumor had started years ago, back when his father was still alive. Ever since, the larger outfits had circled like vultures. If the rumor was true, the land worth had doubled in their minds. If it was false, they would still rather own it than let anyone else find out. The young woman realized then why the visitor had looked at her with such interest. If even a chance of hidden wealth lay under this soil, and she now had a legal claim to part of it. Every decision she made could change the balance of power in this lonely stretch of territory. She was no longer just a poor girl seeking shelter. She had become a key in a lock many hands wanted to turn. A new angle of conflict opened when a letter arrived, carried by a young boy from town. The envelope was addressed to her, not the rancher. Inside was a neatly written note from a man who claimed to be an attorney acting in her best interest. He said he had heard of her situation and wanted to help her understand the full weight of the contract she had signed. He wrote that if she ever felt pressured or unsure, he could arrange a private meeting in town to discuss ways to secure her own future, independent of any rancher or company. She read the letter by the window, fingers shaking just enough to blur the ink. The rancher walked in and saw the paper in her hands. He asked to read it, and she let him. As his eyes moved across the words, his jaw tightened. He said the attorney was not working for her. He was working for the same people who had been trying to break this ranch for years. The note was bait, pure and simple. Instead of tearing the letter up, she folded it carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. When he asked why she kept it, she answered honestly. She said she needed to understand every choice in front of her, even if she did not like who offered it. He looked hurt for a moment, not angry, just wounded, as if her words proved his fear that she might be pulled away by promises of an easier life. She felt a stab of guilt but stood by what she said. Trust, if it was ever going to grow between them, had to be built on truth. From that day, a new kind of distance formed between them. They still worked side by side. They still shared meals at the same table. But there was a quiet space in every conversation where unspoken questions lived. Was she on his side or her own, or no one's yet? Did he see her as a partner or as a tool? Did he ever tell her the whole truth about the debt, the minerals, and the fights he had lost in the past? The subplots around them tightened the noose. The local preacher visited and spoke about sacred vows and the meaning of marriage, dropping hints that a union built on paper alone could not stand before God. A widow from town came by, pretending to offer advice about ranch housekeeping, yet letting slip that the cattle company had hired more men and expanded their fences again. Even the boy who delivered the letter came back once, saying people at The general store had started placing bets on whether the marriage would last through the year. Each word, each visit, each rumor added a new thread to the web closing around the ranch. The young woman found herself split between anger and fear. She hated that strangers treated her life like a story to pass around after church. She feared that no matter what she chose, someone would lose. If she held firm with the rancher, powerful men might come down harder on them both. If she took the path the attorney offered, she might save herself, but destroy whatever small trust had begun to grow here. One evening, as the sky darkened and a thin mist settled over the fields, she found the rancher at the table with the contract spread out, along with his old land papers. His hands were stained with dust from digging through the metal lockbox. He barely looked up when she walked in. He told her he had discovered something he had missed before, a detail hidden in the wording that changed how much control she truly had over the property and how much more dangerous that made things for both of them. He reached for the paper, ready to show her the line that could turn everything upside down. At that exact moment, hoofbeats thundered into the yard, louder and closer than before. More than one horse, more than one rider. The sound shook glasses in the cupboard and sent a chill through her spine. Someone had come back to the ranch, and this time it did not sound like they planned to leave with only words. The hoofbeats grew louder until the ground itself seemed to shake. Lamps trembled on the table, and the window panes rattled as though warning them to stay still. The rancher stood, folding the contract and shoving it into the drawer beside the table. He motioned for her to stay back, but she didn't move far. She could hear voices outside, rough and impatient, like a group that wasn't here to talk, but to claim something before dawn. He stepped onto the porch, lantern in hand. The night was thick with dust, stirred by horses circling the yard. 4 riders sat mounted, coats pulled tight and expressions hidden beneath wide hats. She watched from the doorway as the rancher lifted the lantern higher, asking what they wanted. The lead rider leaned forward, saying they were sent by the cattle company to finish unsettled matters. He said the situation had dragged long enough. And new paperwork in the county office suggested part of the land was no longer solely owned. That gave them grounds to push boundaries further. She felt the weight of his words press against her. There was no mistaking what they meant. The contract had changed things, and now the company was done trying soft persuasion. They wanted movement tonight. The lead rider said they would be inspecting parts of the property at sunrise, and they expected no interference. The rancher refused immediately, saying no one would cross his boundaries without his consent. The rider smirked and said the boundaries were already changing. He tapped his boot against his horse's side, signaling the others to move closer. She stepped onto the porch, unable to stay silent. She asked what right they had to invade private land. The lead rider turned toward her and lifted his hat just enough to show a grin. He said with her recent arrival and shared claim, the land had become disputed territory. He added that some papers suggested she might reconsider her involvement soon, maybe through a visiting attorney. If she withdrew, the rancher would stand alone again. The threat sat between them like a blade. The rancher stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of her. His voice dropped low, but held steady. He told them to leave before sunrise or face legal consequences. The riders laughed, saying the law favored those with money and men, not stubborn ranchers piecing together old fences. They rode off only when a gust of dust pushed against them, fading into the dark like wolves waiting outside campfire light. When the night settled again, she asked why he never warned her how far things had already gone. He said because he didn't want to scare her before she had a chance to adjust. She told him fear wasn't something he could protect her from. She was already in the middle of this, with or without warning. He stared at her a long moment, then finally nodded, as if accepting she was no longer someone to shield, but someone who needed truth. Before she could stand with him fully, the next days were tense. They rode the fence line each morning, checking places where posts had been nudged or markers misplaced. She caught a man from the cattle company camped near one border pretending to hunt. When she approached, he tipped his hat and claimed he was only resting there. But the rolled surveying tools near his saddle told a different story. She told the rancher, and he rode to confront the man, voice sharp, no longer polite. That night, she sat by the fire sorting through papers in the lockbox. She traced maps with her fingers, noticing marks in pencil her eyes had skipped before. The rancher joined her, pulling out the contract again. He showed her the line he discovered, the one that shifted power. According to territorial law, if two owners held shared rights and one faced a legal challenge, both had to stand together, or the land could be claimed as abandoned by one party. That meant if she walked away, the rancher would lose more than before. But if she stayed deeply tied, they stood stronger than any company expected. He said he didn't want to trap her into a life she didn't choose. She reminded him she did choose it, but she needed something clear in return. She needed to know she wasn't just a shield against businessmen. He looked at her, really looked, and the moment hung heavy with words neither had spoken yet, before anything could be said. A distant shout echoed from outside. Not a threat, but a warning. One of the neighboring ranch hands had ridden hard toward the fence line and was waving them down. They both raced outside and mounted horses, following him across the dry grass. Lanterns bobbed in the dark, wind tearing at their clothes. When they reached the ridge, she saw dust clouds swelling near the far border and torchlight moving through the low valley. Men were taking down fence posts. The rancher dismounted and ran, shouting warnings across the field. The group worked fast, pulling stakes from the ground and tossing them aside. She followed, breath burning in her chest, boots hitting rocks and dirt as she tried to keep up. When she reached the workers, she grabbed one of the fallen posts and pushed it upright again. A man cursed at her, saying she didn't know what she was getting involved in. She held the post steady anyway. The rancher confronted the foreman, demanding they stop. The man responded coldly, saying the landline had shifted under new filings in town. They were simply moving posts to reflect current legal control. She could see the rancher's hands clench and unclench, a man ready to fight and just barely holding back. The moment felt like tinder waiting for spark. She stepped between them, asking to see the supposed filings. The foreman hesitated, then pulled folded papers from his coat. She took them, scanning the lines by lantern light. Her heart dropped. The papers showed her name, but not in a way she recognized. They claimed she had signed a statement agreeing to reconsider property alignment. She pointed out the signature looked similar, but not exact. The foreman shrugged and said the county accepted it. Someone had forged her name. When she looked up, the rancher was watching her with an expression filled with fury and something deeper, something protective. He asked her quietly if she had met anyone from town in private, anyone who might have copied her handwriting. She shook her head. She hadn't signed anything except the original contract. The foreman called his men to keep working. The rancher moved toward them, but she grabbed his arm. Fighting them here in the dark would only lead to bloodshed or worse. She told him they needed proof, witnesses, and timing. He stared at her, breathing hard, then pulled back reluctantly, retreating with her and the ranch hand who had warned them as they rode home. She could feel his anger shaking through him, not at her, but at the world closing in. She felt something else rising in her chest, too. She wasn't just caught in his battle. She was part of it now, tied to this soil, chosen or not. The idea scared her, yet it also lit something fierce inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. The next morning, she told the rancher she wanted to go into town with him to face whoever filed the forged paper. He hesitated, saying she might be pressured or manipulated. She said pressure was already on her whether she went or not. He finally agreed, but before they saddled the horses, a wagon appeared at the ranch gate. Two men dressed well stepped down. They introduced themselves as investors representing a new expansion project. They spoke with smooth words, calling her miss and offering opportunities. They said if she separated from the rancher and transferred her claim to them, they would pay enough to change her life. They painted pictures of a home in town, new dresses, income without labor, security where she would never worry about drought or fences. One man spoke gently like he was doing her a favor. The other watched the rancher with quiet smugness. She listened. She didn't flinch. She asked what would happen to the ranch if she agreed. The investors exchanged a look, then admitted it would be broken apart, parceled, and sold. The rancher stiffened like the words cut flesh. They continued, saying land worked by one struggling man was wasted potential. She could help bring progress to the region. She asked the rancher to let her speak alone. He stepped back, jaw tight. She asked the investors one final question. If she agreed, would they guarantee he kept some part of the land? The answer was silence. She told them to leave. Their smiles faded. They warned her she would regret choosing pride over comfort. She stood tall until their wagon rolled down the road and disappeared behind dust. That night she sat by the fire again, staring at the contract. She ran her hand over the ink, feeling every word way more than when she first arrived. The rancher sat across from her, silent, as though waiting for her to speak first. She looked up slowly and told him she wanted to fight beside him. She needed one thing he hadn't given. She needed honesty. He swallowed hard, then reached for the lockbox, pulling it close. He said if she truly wanted truth, he would show everything. Every debt, every letter, every threat. He said he would not ask loyalty before giving her the full picture. She nodded, bracing herself. He opened the box. But before he could unfold the first document, distant gunfire cracked across the valley, sharp and fast. Horses screamed. Men yelled. The sound wasn't coming from far fences this time. It was coming from the road leading straight to the ranch house. She stood, heart racing. He grabbed his coat, eyes narrowing. Someone wasn't waiting for signatures, papers, or negotiations anymore. The conflict had finally reached their door. Gunfire echoed across. Not the land. Like thunder tearing open the night. The rancher pulled on his coat while she grabbed the lantern and followed him outside, her boots sinking into the soft dirt from the earlier rain. The wind carried the smell of dust and burning wood, and in the distance she saw the silhouettes of riders moving fast along the road. Flames flickered behind them, as if someone had set brush fires near the fence line. She felt panic rise, but she forced herself to breathe steady. This was no longer about just staying alive. It was about protecting something they both had a claim to. Something bigger than either of them alone. The rancher told her to stay close, but not behind him. He did not want her hidden anymore. Together, they moved toward the road, passing under the old oak tree where horses were tied earlier that day. She heard shouting, not angry this time, but urgent. When they reached the gate, the ranch hand from the neighboring property waved them over. He said armed workers had come to tear down the fence and seize part of the land, but another group had arrived too, blocking them. When she looked closer, she recognized faces from town. Some were small farmers, old settlers, and even the widow who brought bread days earlier. They weren't siding with the cattle company. They were standing between the ranch and the men who wanted to cut through it. Their lanterns formed a glowing wall across the road. And though many looked nervous, none backed down. The rancher asked why they came. The widow stepped forward and said not everyone wanted the land carved up and sold to businessmen. Some folks remembered how his family helped during droughts, how they opened their barn to neighbors during bad winters. Word had spread that the company was planning to seize the territory by force. Not everyone agreed with that kind of progress. Some wanted the land to remain in the hands of those who worked it. The men from the cattle company tried to push through anyway, shouting that they had legal claims. Their leader held up papers and waved them high, insisting the law was on their side. The rancher stepped forward and demanded to see them. When the man refused, she reached out with calm steadiness and asked again. Maybe it was the tone in her voice, or maybe the crowd watching. But he finally handed her the documents. She unfolded them near the lantern light, scanning every line. Once again her name was written, giving permission to adjust the borders. This time the signature was an even closer imitation to her handwriting. She looked up, heart steady, and told the crowd the signature was not hers. The company man scoffed, saying they had a notary. She held the paper high and shouted across the group that she had never met a notary or signed such permission. The widow stepped forward, eyes sharp, saying she knew handwriting well from years copying church records. She took the document and studied it, then declared it was forged. The crowd murmured. The cattle company's foreman grew tense, and one of his workers pulled his horse back nervously. The rancher told them they had crossed the line, and if they pushed further, the law would finally be forced to act. And this time, witnesses were everywhere. It wasn't just a private dispute in the dark. It was public. The foreman cursed, turned his horse, and rode off with his men. The sound of hooves faded into the hills, leaving silence behind. The people of town lingered a few minutes more, offering quiet encouragement before heading back the way they came. When the road emptied, she finally let out the breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The rancher placed his hand gently on her back, steady and grateful. In that moment, she understood that this land was no longer just his. It was theirs, tied together not by ink alone, but by something deeper. They walked back to the house as dawn stretched pale light across the field. The grass glistened with dew, and the sky carried soft colors instead of smoke. In the kitchen, the rancher finally opened the lockbox again and laid out everything on the table. He showed her each document piece by piece, explaining the debts, the boundaries, and the risks. He told her about the good years and the years that nearly broke him. There were no guarded pauses, no half-truths, just honesty. When he finished, she folded her hands over the last page and told him she was staying. Not because the contract trapped her, not because the land needed her signature, but because she wanted a life where she could grow roots instead of running from place to place. She said the ranch felt like a beginning. He stared at her with tired eyes that finally softened, as if the weight he carried had been lifted just enough to breathe again. Over the next weeks, they repaired the damaged fences with help from neighbors. Folks stopped by not to pry, but to offer hands. The boy who carried letters brought a new stack of updated papers from the county, confirming the forged filings had been rejected. The widow from town sent seeds to plant near the creek bed once water returned. Even the preacher visited, offering to perform a proper ceremony. They decided to take their marriage beyond the contract. She and the rancher worked side by side in the fields. And each evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills. They talked about planting crops next spring, preparing the well so the orchard might grow again, and opening a small trading spot near the road to bring more honest traffic through the ranch. The air felt lighter even as they planned for hard work ahead. One morning, she opened the old locket she kept by her bedside. Inside was a faded scrap of cloth from her childhood home, the only thing she carried when she left everything behind. She placed it gently in a small box the rancher had carved for her, then walked outside to join him as he saddled the horses. He asked if she had slept well, and she answered yes, because for the first time in years, she wasn't waking in a place she intended to leave. She was home. As spring arrived, wildflowers began to grow along the fence line, not planted by anyone, but encouraged by their care. The ranch regained its shape, not perfect but alive. Cattle grazed peacefully under open sky, and the creek bed showed hints of running water after late rain. She stood in the field one morning, watching sunlight stretch across endless land, and she realized that the questions she once asked him had changed meaning entirely. It wasn't just why he wanted her for the land. It was why the land needed both of them to survive. A contract had brought them together, but shared struggle had made them something more. Respect grew first. Trust followed. And in quiet moments, something warmer began to take shape. Not rushed or forced, but steady, like the rising sun. One evening, as the sky turned gold, the rancher walked beside her toward the old oak tree. He stopped, turned to her, and said they had signed their names on paper for necessity. Now he wanted to sign them in choice. He asked her if she would stay as his partner, not because of land or law, but because they had built something worth holding. She answered without hesitation. She took his hand, and together they stood beneath branches whispering in the wind, as if the land itself acknowledged the promise. The ranch was no longer a battlefield. It was a shared future, and this time, no one could take it.